Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Last Line of Defense. I have the great honor of being joined today. It's November 24th by Ambassador Doug Lute. Doug served 6 years as in the White House during 2 administrations. First, under President George W. Bush as Deputy National Security Advisor for Iraq and Afghanistan from 2007 to 2009, and then eventually U.S. Ambassador to NATO. So, Ambassador Lute or General Lute, you have a you span the military and the diplomatic sphere, so perfect for a conversation on peace in Ukraine ? So appreciate having you on the program.
Sure, it's good to be with you, Seth. Although the title of the podcast, The Last Line of Defense, does raise some concerns for me as an old soldier. So I look forward to our conversation.
Okay, well, maybe this won't be the last line. All right, let's talk about the 28-point proposal first. The entire plan has not been made public, though some specifics have been made public. So from your perspective, what are some of the main points and sort of what are your overall conclusions based on what you've seen?
Well, I think the overarching theme of this so-called 28-point plan is that it dramatically undermines Ukrainian sovereignty, while at the same time heavily favoring Russia's interests. Now, let me give you a few examples. We won't go 28 points one at a time. First of all, it calls for Ukraine to give up sovereignty of territory that is not now occupied by the Russian forces. It calls for Ukraine to give up hopes of membership in NATO, which is typically a sovereign decision. It gives up Ukraine's right to scale its armed forces, the size of its armed forces, to its defense needs. It puts a limit on the size of the Ukrainian armed forces. It specifies that Ukraine will not invite Western forces into Ukraine as part of some sort of guarantee process. It specifies, this is perhaps the most extreme, it actually specifies that Ukraine will conduct elections within 100 days. I mean, what decision is more sovereign than elections? And it also tinkers with the reconstruction process inside Ukraine. So it imagines at the end of the fighting, there'll be reconstruction funding flowing into Ukraine, but it specifies how that funding would be used, how it would be distributed, all the way to include, surprisingly, a provision for U.S. profiting from this reconstruction process. So significant constraints, even, I would say, assaults on Ukrainian sovereignty. On the other hand, on the Russian side, Russia is sort of welcomed back into good order, into the system of global affairs, into the global economy. Sanctions are relieved. Russia's even offered membership back into the G7, which of course became the G8, which of course became the G7 because Russia was booted after the 2014 invasion of Crimea.
And Ambassador Lute, if you go down to places like Sea Island, Georgia,
right,
you can actually see President Putin there at what was at that point the G8.
Right. Exactly right. And so they'd be welcomed back. The G7 would again become the G8. Significant sanctions relief for Russia. And how about this? Full amnesty for war crimes. And of course, today, Putin stands as an indicted war criminal by the ICC, just based on the abduction of Ukrainian children and the dispatching of them, the kidnapping of them into Ukraine. So look, at the end of the day, as I reread the 28 points, I think the lead sentence in point number 28, so the last element, really captures the whole story. And it reads as follows. Once all parties agree to this memorandum, the ceasefire will take place indefinitely and so forth. The bottom line is that phrase, once all parties agree, should give us some assurance that this will never happen.
All right. So let me start off with this question I mean, based on what you just outlined, and even some of the details. So, if you look at the size of Ukraine's military, which is currently just under 900,000, the Ukrainian military would have to come down to something closer to 600,000, uh, which raises some big questions about security within Ukraine. I mean, it looks a lot to almost any objective observer that the points, at least in the original proposal, were very favorable to the Russians. Is that a fair reading of the 28-point proposal?
I think that's absolutely fair. That's the sort of the Cliff Notes version of this whole agreement, is heavily constraining or undermining Ukrainian sovereignty and favoring Russian interests. On your point with regard to the 600,000 so-called restriction on Ukrainian armed forces, there's no parallel restriction on Russian forces. And so it's just that point alone, I think, highlights the disparity, the incongruence of the agreement, or of the plan.
All right, so I do want to look at this from both a glass half full and half empty. On the positive side, what is the good news about where we're at right now? I mean, we are talking right now about
Right.
The possibility of ending or at least creating a ceasefire. But are there some positive signs in what's going on?
Well, I think the first one is, as you just say, at least we're talking about this. And we're not just resigning ourselves to endless conflict. So, and I think this springs fundamentally from a sincere interest, a sincere concern by the Trump administration and by the president himself personally, that he's disgusted by the loss of life, and he sincerely wants to bring this to a close. Now, you might argue exactly what's behind that sincerity and so forth, but the bottom line is he's been quite consistent in wanting to bring this war to an end.
And if I could just interject, his wife has also expressed concern about the atrocities being committed by the Russians in Ukraine as well. So we know from his other half there has been concern as well about the atrocities.
Right. So he's hearing this in the Oval Office, he's hearing it on the international scene, and he's hearing it at home. Right. So this is this has a way of focusing one's interests. And so I think his desire to end the war is sincere. It's good that we're talking. Now, it'd be better if we were talking with the same script at the same time to the same parties, and we're not there yet. We're having sort of piecemeal conversations that end up being refuted later and disputed and reverse course and so forth. But at least we're talking. I think it's also positive, as much as we might critique this 28-point plan, the fact that there is a plan and that it's in writing helps, because it does allow for considered debate and objections to be raised and so forth. So there are some positive signs here, Seth. At least we're talking.
All right. So let me go on to a couple of questions. And the first one is, who is in charge? I mean, we've got Witkoff involved in some of the negotiations. Certainly Marco Rubio, he's the one that's been talking publicly. We've got, obviously, the president. We've got Kushner now, probably not Kellogg, who that's been now made public is leaving the administration. We've had Driscoll involved in some of the conversations. It was interesting when I saw President Zelensky after his last Oval Office meeting with the president. I think one of the frustrations from the Ukrainian side, and I've heard this, I heard this from talking to European leaders, both at NATO headquarters the week before last, as well as in London, is there is some frustration about who is in charge on the U.S. side and questions about incoherence in the way that the U.S. is proceeding. But what's your take on who's in charge? And are there some bigger issues? I mean, I'm really talking about the National Security Council system that are making this hard.
Right. I mean, I think you've put your finger on a key point. I mean, it's hard to say among those 6 or 7 Americans that you just mentioned who actually is in the lead here. Now, naturally, you would imagine that the Secretary of State would be in the forefront of such a diplomatic initiative. In this case, you have the Secretary of State who he's dual-hatted as a national security advisor. So that would really put weight on Marco Rubio as the lead here. But it's not clear that this so-called 28-point plan actually emanated from Rubio's office or even with Rubio's consent. And rather, it appears that it came out of some meeting between Witkoff and a Russian counterpart. And that in part may reflect why it's so heavily weighted towards Russian interests. So look, in a process as complicated as this, it's first and foremost important for the American side, internal to the American side, to secure American interests, to identify American interests, to debate different approaches to how to secure American interests, and then to produce a plan before going to outside parties. And what appears to be the case here is that we don't have that internal U.S. government coherence, but yet now we're engaging multiple outside parties. And the result is predictable. That is that we've got confusion, we've got finger pointing left and right about where the plan came from, who was at the table when the plan was crafted, who released the plan, at least the version that's bouncing around publicly, and now what to do about it. And there's a bit of a catch-up game now, apparently led by Secretary Rubio in Geneva, to try to bring some degree of coherence to what has otherwise been a very incoherent process. And it first and foremost starts with who's in charge.
So you were the ambassador to NATO. There is certainly an important role of NATO and a number of European countries in this whole process. They've been providing significant weapons systems and other aid to Ukraine over the course of this war, as has the United States. We've also seen a number of countries like Poland getting visited by drones. We've seen manufacturing plants in the UK, France, Germany being targeted, blown up by bombs from what looks like it's probably the main intelligence within the Russian Ministry of Defense, the GRU. So the Europeans have had to deal with this irregular effort in Europe, probably partly a function of the war in Ukraine, but also they have been providing aid. And frankly, if you look at any of those countries that border Russia, from Finland to the Baltic states to Poland and even south of Poland, there is a serious concern about the Russians. So how have the Europeans been involved in the negotiations? And what are you hearing from your sources in Europe about this?
Well, I think the list of transgressions or so-called hybrid attacks that you just mentioned is accurate, and the pattern's actually broader than that. And more recently, I think even over this last weekend, you had the reports of sabotage, of physical sabotage of a Polish rail line, which in part is
I've taken that I've taken that train on that rail line
right.
from Poland into Ukraine.
Right. This is one of the parts of the network that provides military assistance into Ukraine. So that was attacked. And I'd also add to your list the disruption of undersea cables in the Baltic Sea, both energy cables, but electrical lines and communications lines and so forth. So look, I think all of that goes to illustrate that beyond Russia's immediate objective, which is to deny Ukrainian sovereignty, and to dominate Ukraine as a nation state, as a subservient proxy of Russia itself. So beyond that immediate goal, there's a deeper, more strategic goal, and that is Russia's long-term effort to divide the West, to confuse, obfuscate, make foggy what's actually happening inside the West itself. This goes to election interference, it goes to misinformation campaigns and so forth, and cause the European allies, alongside their NATO allies, the U.S., to be sort of self-absorbed and consumed internally with these sorts of debates, meaning that they're distracted from support to Ukraine, and they're distracted from Russia's violations of international norms and international law. So this is a two-part campaign. There's the near fight for Russia, which is Ukraine, and then there's the deeper, more strategic fight against the West. So all of these things, I think, play to that. How has NATO responded? Well, this goes back to the time in 2014 when I was in the chair as the U.S. ambassador at the time when Russia illegally annexed the Crimea Peninsula, sovereign Ukrainian territory. And then a couple months later in 2014, began to support separatist groups, Ukrainian separatist groups in the Donbass, right, and the two southeastern provinces of Ukraine. And at that time, the alliance began a campaign, an extended process of responding to what was now clear, which is that Putin wanted to reconstruct as much of the near periphery as part of a new Russian empire as much as he could, right? And he had already taken similar steps in Georgia. You're now seeing the destabilization of Ukraine. And the 2014 prelude really set the stage for what we saw by way of the full-scale invasion in 2022. So in the response to the 2014 prelude, NATO's first and foremost responsibility, which is now reflected in their actions on the ground, was to abide by the Washington Treaty, abide by their treaty obligations to defend NATO. And they did so by positioning for the first time NATO troops under a NATO flag in the East, so the Baltic states and Poland, where NATO troops never had a presence before 2014. There were no NATO flags in the Baltic states and Poland before 2014. After 2014, we positioned multinational forces there, in part to reassure those allies, who, by the way, had all lived under the thumb of Soviet oppression for decades after World War II, right? So these are new allies with fresh memories of what it's like to live under Russian authority. So we deployed NATO troops to reassure them that what was happening in Ukraine would not cross the red line of NATO boundaries. It would not happen to them. But we also did it as a message to Moscow that NATO was taking steps to actually do what Article 5 of the Washington Treaty promises, and that is to actually defend itself and to respond to any form of aggression as though aggression on one state would be considered as aggression against now all 32 NATO allies. So that was the beginning of what NATO did to respond to this threat. Since then, so over the next 10 years, you've seen things like 10 consecutive years of increased European defense spending. So not 1 year in the wake of the 2014, but 10 consecutive years. You've seen the addition of two key allies as a result of the 2022 invasion, Sweden and Finland.
Yeah.
Right. Long-standing neutral states. Finland with the longest European land border with Russia, neighboring Russia, right? Who, because of 2014, followed by 2022, took national decisions to reverse centuries of neutrality and bring themselves in line with NATO. You've seen European allies recently, especially in the last year, overtake the United States in terms of the quantity and quality of support, both military support and economic support to Ukraine. So you've seen NATO actually do quite a bit in terms of responding to the Russian invasions, both 2014 and more recently amplified by 2022.
I will say, though, just reading the public comments from European officials out of European capitals in the last couple of days, the response so far to the 28-point proposal has generally not been positive. Most of what I've seen is it looks very supportive of Russian interests, and also some comments that, we were not involved in any meaningful way. So I think it is part of the next step. How do you get the Europeans more involved in the next stage of these discussions?
Well, look, in conventional terms, right? I've already mentioned that diplomacy typically starts with America focused on its interests and an internal to the U.S. government conversation about policy and strategy and how to move forward, right? That obviously didn't take place in this case. But typically, after that conventional first step, the next step is to engage first your allies, upon whom you're going to rely for support, and who may actually, based on this draft plan, incur some obligations. So one would think that before releasing this to the Russians or even the Ukrainians, the Trump administration might have first gone to the Europeans, on whose success of the plan depends, right? But the plan, it's not just the Europeans who were left out. The Ukrainians, of course, first and foremost, were left out, right, and were presented the plan after some sort of agreement between the U.S. and Russia. Although the degree of that agreement is now disputed because it's proven contested. But you'd think the Ukrainians would be involved. You'd think NATO would be involved. As you read through the 28-point plan, there are others who would incur obligations who have not been consulted. So the United Nations, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the World Bank would incur obligations, and none of them were consulted in advance. This approach is not a way to win favor with those parties who you eventually need as part of the agreement, because they feel disrespected from the outset by not being engaged. And it's also just not a way to build confidence that the U.S. knows what it's doing, that there is a deliberate process with someone in charge that's going to result in reasonable proposals that have already been considered in terms of pros and cons and risks and so forth. Without a deliberate policymaking, strategy design behind such proposals, our partners lose confidence in us as strategic players, and most important is us as a key ally. So the damage here is not simply a couple days of drama in the press. Okay, it goes beyond that.
Yeah.
It's an erosion of confidence in the American ability to formulate strategy and then to pursue support for that strategy and eventually someday execute it on the ground.
All right, so I have to ask, because the last question here is where does this leave us? Despite what some might believe, the Russians have had notable challenges on the battlefield. They've certainly made some advances around the Pokrovsk area or Kupiansk right now, but they went over the 1 million casualty mark over the summer. Their average rates of advance on many of the axes where they're fighting is slower than during the Battle of the Somme during World War I. The amount of territory that they've been able to control over the last 18 or 19 months of the war since they've been on the offensive have been less than 1% of Ukrainian territory. And, someone pointed out to me recently, I double-checked the facts here, that by this time, during World War II, the Soviet Red Army was already in Berlin now. They had stomached the German offensive during Operation Barbarossa, and they'd fought all the way and were in Berlin by this point, and they're in Pokrovsk now. I mean, certainly those wars are different, but it does highlight the challenge that the Russian military is faced and the economy is certainly in right now. But what is your sense about what is likely? Because what do you think the Ukrainians are likely to be willing to accept? What are the Russians likely to accept? And where do you think we'll be several weeks from now?
Well, I think on the Ukrainian side, their willingness to accept outcomes is quite hardened by the fact that they're actually fighting for their very existence. I mean, the Ukrainians know what Russian occupation will look like. They know this because Russia has occupied 5 of their provinces, right? Crimea and 4 in mainland sovereign Ukrainian territory. And they know what life is like in those occupied territories. And this has to do with the kidnapping of children, war crimes, mass oppression of the people, no economic development, and so forth. So it's quite clear from the Ukrainian perspective that they're fighting for their national existence. That doesn't mean that they have to have every square inch of Ukrainian territory recovered in order to come to an agreement. It doesn't mean that they expect the surrender of the Russian occupying forces. They know that that's unlikely. So I think, first of all, Zelensky has for about 6 months now agreed to a unconditional ceasefire, a multidimensional air, sea, and land ceasefire that would go both ways and be monitored by some sort of international monitoring body. Putin has refused that for the same 6 months. So the fact that Zelensky has already crossed the political line of being willing to ceasefire where we are now and talk about this is a very positive step. I think, look, Zelensky also knows that the recovery of the occupied Russian territory now occupied by Russia is unlikely in the near term.
Including Crimea, I'm sure.
Including Crimea. So I think while he hasn't been explicit about this, I think there's a realization that in the near term, Zelensky and the Ukrainian people, in return for an end to the fighting, would accept de facto that the Russians occupy these territories. So they're willing to do that. What he's not willing to do is essentially surrender Ukrainian sovereignty at the hand of Russian aggression. I mean, that's just not going to fly. And it's not only personal for Zelensky, which I'm sure it is. It would be personal for any democratically elected replacement to Zelensky.
It would be political suicide for him to do that.
It's crazy. They're fighting to be a democracy, and something like 80% of the Ukrainian people support the war against Russia, and the fact that they want to be a sovereign nation. They actually believe, Seth, get this, they believe in the UN Charter, right? Which says in the second article, the UN Charter states out the principles of territorial integrity and national sovereignty. Everything since the 1945 UN Charter has been based on that until now. So that's what Ukraine is willing to talk about. Frankly, on the Russian side, I'm increasingly of the belief that for Vladimir Putin personally, he can't accept anything that looks like a loss in Ukraine. He has invested so much. You mentioned the million-plus Russian casualties, but beyond that, the gross distortion of the Russian economy, placing on a war footing, the inflation rates, the interest rates, essentially the selling or mortgaging of the future of Russia's economic well-being and prosperity. He sacrificed all of that for this so-called special military operation.
And he's been very explicit. I mean, it's been interesting to watch what he's done even in the year before the invasion, the full-scale invasion. He wrote or had someone write on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians. So he has publicly noted with his name on the document that he believes Ukraine is part of Russia.
So so I therefore conclude, I deduce that an end of the war for him, given the high cost that the war has imposed, that he has imposed on the Russian people to further the war, means the end of Vladimir Putin. And that, I think, fundamentally is what many of our European allies believe, that this war has become existential for Putin himself. Now, not necessarily for Russia as a nation state, but for the leadership in the Kremlin today, that this war has become existential for them as well. And therefore, I don't see this 28-point plan or any other maybe more appropriately crafted, more deliberately coordinated plan actually being worthy of negotiation or likely to lead to a ceasefire. My guess is, my unfortunate estimate is that next year, as we approach Thanksgiving of 2026, you and I could be on another podcast talking about the war in Ukraine.
Well, I will definitely invite you to have that conversation at that time. I mean, that is what it certainly looks like right now, despite the fact that U.S. politicians, some of them anyway, would like this to end by this Thanksgiving. You know, it is interesting talking to a number of Republican senators and House members. They are very nervous about a deal that hands the Russians what is essentially a political, military, and economic victory, which is the way you outlined. So there is some bipartisan concern for the way these negotiations are happening. Well, Ambassador Lute, General Lute, and Doug Lute, 3 in 1. I appreciate you taking the time to talk with us today on a complicated subject, one that we hope will resolve itself, but I'm afraid I'm of the same mindset as you. I think this one has all the hallmarks of continuing to be fought on the battlefields of Ukraine and Russia itself, and then probably some areas of Europe for the foreseeable future. But thanks for taking time.
Not at all. Unfortunately, I think you're right. And thanks to you and your CSIS team as we go into the holidays for all that you do to illuminate these sorts of tough topics for the broader public.
Well, great. Thanks, Ambassador Lute. Appreciate it. Thanks for listening to our episode today. Please subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. For more analysis, please visit csis.org. This is The Last Line of Defense.